Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. Today I'm talking about short story myths. Despite the fact that short stories are like my thing, like that's really what I'm all about. Is short fiction. That's what I live and breathe for. I used to hate short stories and I know a lot of people who used to hate short stories. So this video is just a combination of things I see floating around about short stories where I'm like, no. And also things that I used to think about short stories. A lot of people get a really bad impression of short fiction from high school. I don't know why, but they make you read the absolute worst short stories in high school. And it's like, how is anyone going to come out of this thinking short stories are cool? They give you the most dull, obtuse short fiction, and it's like, I still remember the English textbook that we had. I swear this was like the textbook that they bought when they founded the high school 50 years ago, and they never replaced it, I don't think. And it just had the dumbest short stories that all felt like they were trying to like teach you a lesson. And I even remember having like one of my English teachers hated this book too. She was like, this is the worst textbook. I hate that I have to teach it. What I don't understand about English teachers who like have these really bad textbooks is why don't they just get stories online and teach those? They would be way more interesting and way more relevant. Today I'm going to be talking about a bunch of misconceptions about short fiction, and also because I want to convert you. I'll be honest about my motives. I think short fiction is great, and I was converted, and I'm here to convert you. So the first misconception is maybe the most common. It's the most high school Englishy, and therefore the one that's probably going to make you hate short fiction the most. And if this is what you've been taught, and it's that short stories need to have a theme or a message. Do I think that most stories will have a theme, intentional or not, from the author? Yeah, it's hard to write a work without there being themes. There's this idea about short fiction in particular, which is that the most important thing is the theme or the message, the philosophical statement. How often do you hear people say about short stories, or you've said about short stories yourself, I didn't get it? And what you mean by that is I didn't get the theme. I didn't get what the message was, because we're taught that short stories are meant to have a theme and a message, and that's the point of them. Which is weird because I think we can all really agree that that's not always the point of a novel. It can be the point of a novel, but it doesn't have to be. The point of a novel can be entertainment. It can be character study. It can be a range of things, right? And the point of a short story can also be entertainment or character study or a range of things. It is important, I think, when you're writing a short story that you accomplish something, but that thing doesn't have to be thematic, and it certainly doesn't have to be a moral. That's part of why I hated all the stories they made me read in English, because they all had morals. And I almost automatically dislike a story that has a moral because it feels a little condescending. It's like, thanks, I didn't pick up this story as a guide to be a good person. And now this is making it seem like I'm saying you can't write stories with a message, which you can if you want to. I just don't like the presumption that that has to be the point, or that it has to be about the theme. It can just be about the character. And when I usually think of theme in a short story, it's usually more about like what theme is being said about this specific character, not about humanity in general. Short story is just a form, but what you accomplish with that form is up to you. Number 2 is that short stories are restrictive or limiting. And I get where this comes from. The word count is shorter, so naturally you hear that and you're like, well, that's going to be restrictive and limiting. In my experience, it's a less restrictive form than a novel, because what you're not restricted by is time. I don't know how fast you can write a novel. I take a couple years. That's a huge commitment, and there are just certain concepts that can't be sustained for that long, or would be incredibly hard to sustain that long. With a short story, it's so short, you're free to do literally anything. You can do the strangest, most bizarre thing, and you only need to sustain it for a couple thousand words. Think about the looseness and freedom of a poem. Can really be anything. You don't really hear it said often that poetry is a restrictive form. I think poetry is often thought of as the freest form. Poems have shorter word counts than short stories do, and we don't consider them restricting because the shortness of the form is what makes it free. And that's what I think about short stories. Yes, it's a smaller word count, but that smaller word count actually gives you more freedom. You can do literally anything, and you don't have to worry about executing it or failing to execute it. You can break all the rules that you want, do whatever you want, experiment, have fun. That's why I love short fiction so much, is because the short form allows you to experiment and is just kind of a playground to try new things and do wacky stuff. The third misconception is that short stories are for beginners. Do I think short stories can be great for beginners? Yes. but they're not only for beginners. And I sometimes see this idea that short fiction is like the easy form of fiction, so that's what you learn from, and then you graduate short stories and you move on to novels and you don't go back because novels are more advanced. It is a great form to learn. There's debate over this. I do think it's probably easier to learn how to write from short fiction than from novels. That's what I thought. I improved a lot more writing short fiction than novels because it allows you that freedom. You can try more things. You can do more drafts of a piece, and it's easier to learn and apply the fundamentals because you're not dealing with the task of mental organization, honestly, just general organization that goes into a novel. I do think they make it easier to learn the principles. However, they're not just for beginners, and it's not like when you master the short story, then you move on to novels and you don't look back. I will always be writing short fiction. It's where I have the most fun writing. And that brings me to my next point, which is 2 points combined because I see them both. And it's short stories are easier than novels, but also that they're harder. I see it both, and here's what I have to say. It depends. It depends on the person. To be honest, it just depends on the work. They both have their own unique challenges. Novels are very complicated. They require a lot of organization. They require you to balance and weave a lot of elements in a very complicated way. Whereas short stories require a very extreme amount of precision and you have to do something very well in a very short amount of space. That's one reason why I think writing short stories will improve your novel writing skills, because learning to do something really well in a short amount of space means that you can do something really well in a short amount of space over and over in every single scene of your novel. Neither is in general harder or easier. My personal experience, just speaking for me, the process of writing a novel is harder. It takes longer. We're looking at months to over a year for just a first draft compared to just a couple writing sessions for a short story. They just require you to balance and juggle so many more things. But I actually think short stories are harder to do well. To write a good short story, it really has to be a knockout of the park. You have to do so many things so well, so precisely in a really short amount of time. It's very difficult. So I think novels are harder to write, but short stories are harder to execute well, in my opinion. But neither is really inherently harder or easier. It really depends on the person, and to be honest, the one that's probably harder for you is just the one you have less exposure to. I remember when I was writing the first short story that I ever had to write for in university, and I remember thinking while I was writing it, this is harder than a whole novel. Like, I would take a whole novel over this, and I certainly don't feel that way anymore. At the time, I had so little exposure to short stories that writing one literally felt harder than a novel. So it's probably just going to be the one you've had less exposure to will feel harder for you, but neither is inherently easier or harder. The difficulty of a form is more dependent on the piece itself. Like, one short story could maybe require months or years of research if the story requires that. Like, different pieces have different levels of difficulty, so that are completely separate from the form. Number 5 is that there's no audience for short fiction. And that's just not true. There is. Is the audience smaller than novels? Yeah, probably. There are collections that sell. Do they sell as well as novels? Usually not, but there are still collections that sell very well. There are so many literary magazines, and some of them have huge readerships. Part of the reason there's not a huge audience for short stories is they're just not prioritized as much. People aren't exposed to them as much. They don't know where to find good short stories, and part of the reason why I think it's a bit harder with short stories, you're usually convinced to read a novel because of the concept, right? You pick it up at the store, you read the back, you're like, that sounds like something I would like, and so you read it. It's rare that you get a pitch for a short story. You know, you encounter a short story online in a magazine, you're not really told what it's about. You kind of just have to take a leap of faith and see if you'll enjoy it. And so I think it can be a bit harder to get people on board, but at the same time, like, I don't know, are they the form of the future? They thrive online. Does that not make them a really great way to reach people who don't have much time or don't really read fiction and so aren't going to pick up a whole novel? The more we celebrate short fiction, the more of an audience and a readership there can be. So next up is a bit of a technical one, and it's that short stories can't be over 8,000 words. The thing about short stories and word count, there isn't like a defined limit. If you look it up, different sources will give you different upper maximums. 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, 12,000. The line between long short story and novelette, which is a term very few people use anyways, and short novella is blurry. Is it a long novella or a short novel? Is it flash fiction or is it a prose poem? Is it a long short story or is it a novelette or is it just a short novella? It kind of depends on how the author structures it, how they just describe it, how they market it. There's a lot of overlap and gray area between these different forms. There isn't like a distinct ceiling. It's not like your story is over 8,000 and it's suddenly not a short story, it's now a novelette. Personally, I think the difference between a novella and a short story is more in how it's structured than necessarily the exact word count. Like, I think that there could be a short story that is even technically longer than a novella, depending on how they're structured. Short stories are structured more as one continuous episode. If you're looking to publish your short story, different publication outlets will take different word counts. Be aware of word count and how it's going to affect your publishing opportunities based on the publishing opportunities that you're interested in. But I wouldn't really worry about like a word count cap because there isn't a defined one. Number 7 is that short stories can't be plot driven. A short story is just a short piece of fiction. But other than that, it can really be anything. It can be plot driven, it can be character driven, it can be theme driven, it could be voice driven, it could be atmosphere driven, it could be form driven, it could even be driven by aesthetic, world, emotion, really, etc. Short stories can totally be plot driven. Now, is it a little harder to write a plot-driven short story? Yeah, probably. You only have a few thousand words, so it's hard to create like a super twisty, turny plot. But a short story can still be plot-driven. Short story isn't defined as a character-driven short piece of work. It's just a short piece of fiction. And you can do literally whatever you want within that, and that can certainly include being plot-driven. Number 8 is that a character needs to change for a story to be character-driven. Now, obviously, this is pretty much what we usually consider character-driven work, is that the character changes. But I don't know if that's really accurate. There's plenty of plot-driven work where the character is dynamic and goes through an arc. But I think in short fiction especially, you can still have character-driven stories where the character does not change. For a short story to be character-driven, one of two things needs to happen. Either the character needs to change or our understanding of them needs to change. But as long as something is said or revealed about that character and we're exploring an aspect of them, maybe they don't change, maybe there's a potential for them to change, but they don't take it. It's a little limiting to put this limit. Your character must change, must have a distinct arc. I think we need to sense movement in a character, but that might be movement as we learn about them and we explore new aspects of them and we go on a journey. But I don't think it needs to be this clear-cut, like, A to B, character was this, now they are this. It's hard to write a character-driven novel where the character doesn't change. The point of a novel is that you're undergoing a pretty long journey with a character. I'm not saying it can't be done, and maybe it can be done. Maybe someone can think of an example for me in the comments, which would be great. But in a short story, again, you have such little space that literally, like, go nuts, do anything. The way that you explore a character and say something about them may not involve them actually changing. Number 9 is that you can't publish a story you've published in a magazine in a collection. I'm just gonna squash it right now. It's a misconception, and I understand why the confusion is out there. You usually, and I'm putting a little asterisk next to usually, which we'll come back to, cannot publish a short story you've already published in a magazine. So if you want to submit your stories to magazines, but it's been published in a book, an anthology, you've published it online, or it's been published in another magazine, you probably can't submit it to most magazines. The little asterisk there is that there are magazines that accept reprints, some accept translations of previously published stories, and some may accept stories that were previously published if the print run was very small or under certain conditions. But yeah, in general, you can only publish a story in a magazine one time and it has to be unpublished work. However, you can traditionally publish a short story collection where some of the collections were previously published in magazines. And I've heard it said that you can't, and I don't know where this is coming from because pick up any traditionally published collection, look in the index, and you'll see the list of where all the stories were previously published. It's actually not just common, it's actually expected. It shows that you have an audience. For a debut collection, usually half to 2/3 of the collection will have been previously published. When a publisher buys the rights to your book, and that includes short stories in a collection, they are usually buying exclusive rights. And for the book to be published elsewhere, say by a foreign press, those rights need to be negotiated. I don't really know how that works. But magazines don't work like that. They usually take first rights. Basically, all that means is we're getting the right to be the first one to publish this. So when you sign this contract, you're confirming that this has never been published before. But after it's published, all the rights revert back to you. So I've published like 10 or 11 short stories in magazines, and I own the rights to all of them. I could publish all of them in a collection tomorrow. I would credit the magazines, of course. But I don't even have to ask their permission because I can do whatever I want with those stories. Number 10 is that short stories are a completely different skill set than novels. And so learning how to write short stories won't help your novel writing. I think this is part of this big debate over, do you need to write short stories to be a novelist? On one hand, there's the people saying, yes, you should start with short stories because that's like saying that you should learn to fly a plane without learning to drive first. This idea that they're built on the same skill set, but novels are a more advanced form of that skill set. And so you should learn the basics, short fiction, before you take the advanced route, novels. You know, the old learn to walk before you can run kind of argument. But then there's this other argument, and you also get analogies about this, where it's basically like, they're completely different skill sets. Learning to write short fiction is just its own skill set, completely separate from a novel. It won't help your novel writing. My issue with the first argument is something I've already talked about, which is this idea that short stories are for beginners and are the less advanced form of fiction. Novels are for experienced writers and are the more advanced form of fiction. My issue with the other argument, which is that they're unrelated, is simply that that is not true. The overlap of skill set between short story and novel is not identical, but there is a lot of overlap. You are applying these skills in a different way, but they still apply. And I would say that writing novels can make you a better short story writer. And I would say that writing poetry can make you a better novelist. And I would say that writing novels can make you a better screenwriter, etc., etc. Writing any form of writing will improve your skills in other forms of writing. So I do think that learning to write short stories will make you a better fiction writer in general and will improve your novel writing skills. In general, what you learn in a short story is just how to do everything more efficiently, how to accomplish a ton in very little space. And that's why I think that those skills apply really well to a novel. If you learn to really maximize 20 pages and get the most you can out of 20 pages, and then you apply that to a novel, now imagine how much you're going to be able to get out of 300 pages, right? You're going to be able to extract the full potential of those 300 pages if you've learned how to extract the full potential from 20 pages or 5 pages. Short fiction can help your novels be just punchier, more effective, more efficient, more precise, because you've learned how to get the most out of a chapter, the most out of a scene, the most out of a single paragraph, and how to do everything more efficiently. And when you can do everything more efficiently, you can write a novel that is so much richer and accomplishes so much more because you really know how to extract a ton from very little. Now imagine applying that to when you have 300 pages to play with, right? So I don't really believe or agree with the fact that short stories are the beginner or easy version of fiction, because in many ways they are extremely challenging and they do present different challenges from a novel. I'm not saying that the skill sets for these forms are identical, because they are not identical. I would say that the skills you learn from a short fiction you can apply to a novel in order to write a stronger novel. And I can say that with utmost confidence. Obviously, they're not the same. A novel isn't just a big short story, just like a short story is just a whittled down novel. But they are both forms of fiction. Learning one will help you with the other, and it does go both ways. So no, short story isn't like a training wheel. It's not an exercise, it's not the easy form. It's not an easier form to execute necessarily. I think it's easier to learn the principles of good writing from short fiction. I mean, I can tell you that I don't think I was a good writer until I learned to write a short story. And the final misconception is that short stories are boring. This all boils back to a silly little English class. I don't know why. They make you read the most boring short stories, and so you're gonna come away from short fiction with this idea probably that short stories are boring. No form is inherently boring. Like, a short fiction is just a form. It's not a genre, and again, no genre is inherently boring. There's just boring work. There's boring work in any form or any genre, and also what's boring depends on the person. That's just people having tastes, but no form is inherently boring, especially not short fiction, which, because it's so short, I mean, I would argue that a novel is more likely to have boring bits. Whereas short fiction really takes, a lot of cases, the most important moment of a character's life, or a important moment, a crucial moment, maybe not the most important, but a crucial moment, and just explores that. And so short stories really, they don't make you wait for it, they don't draw it out. I would argue that the form itself inherently is probably less boring because there's no room to be boring. Obviously you can still write a boring short story, you can write an extremely exciting novel. No, like I said, no form is inherently boring, but the whole point of novels is they're more drawn out, you really explore things much more deeply. Short stories are a lot of times a single moment or just a single aspect of a character's life that's super compelling. It whittles down to the most compelling, exciting aspect. So that's my video on short fiction and myths and misconceptions about short fiction. As someone who loves short fiction, like, it's really my cause. I love it so much. These are the things that just hurt me a little when I hear them. They hurt a little, they sting a little, and I'm like, ooh, no, the disrespect, because apparently it is my life's mission to defend the honor of the short story. My question for this video is, I just want to know, what is your favorite short story? If it's online, if you could leave a link, that would be great. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you know, I have something to ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.